It's hard to imagine America without highways. The Interstate Highway System has nearly 47,000 miles of paved roads, connecting the whole nation. Now, whether you use it or not, you have to admit that it's pretty impressive. America is the third largest country in terms of size. So if it wasn't for the Interstate Highway System, getting from one place to another would be quite a challenge. Today, nearly 260 million vehicles use them religiously. However, recently the nation seems to have fallen out of love with its highways. America is actively spending billions to remove highways and opposing the construction of new ones. So what really happened in between? Why has a car-obsessed country suddenly decided to push the brakes on highways? And what are they going to replace it with? Believe it or not, there was a time when America wasn't car-centric at all. Cities like Baltimore, Detroit, and Cleveland were inclined towards the European urban designs. Streets were meant for pedestrians and not cars. That's partly because cars were a rare sight in the 1920s. At the time, there was one car for 18,000 people. Fast forward to today, America has more than 280 million cars and trucks. The big shift came when Henry Ford introduced the Model T in 1908. This was an affordable and reliable option for the masses. Many automobile manufacturers followed his steps and started bulk producing cars. Detroit in Michigan became a central hub for automobile production. Even though people were buying cars, automobile companies still faced many problems. The state of roads in America during the early 20th century wasn't so great. For example, in 1924, there were some 23,000 deaths and $1 billion loss in property damage. Cars started being viewed as an evil entity, and driving was labeled as a misadventure. This was a big problem for automobile companies. They had to fix their bad image and convince people to keep buying their product. However, if the roads were poor or insufficient, what's the point of purchasing even the coolest car in the world? So the automobile companies had to invent the need to use cars. And the only way to do that was to create hundreds of miles of roads, better known as highways. Big auto companies like General Motors, Ford, and others joined hands to form the American Highway Users Alliance. This group actively lobbied for the creation of highways that would connect cities to cities and urban centers to rural setups. They urged the government to use the taxpayer money and invest it in highway construction. General Motors displayed a future model of American highways at the 1939 World Fair. It showed a world with automated highways and vast suburbs. The public, unaware of the risks that lay ahead, got all excited. After all, what was the harm in cutting down a months-long journey to a matter of hours? The big break for highways came when President Eisenhower took power. Eisenhower was a fan of highways and was able to pass the National Highway Act of 1956. He was able to set aside a budget of $25 billion just for this purpose. The auto companies were happy to be heard. The locals were also happy since 90% of the construction budget was covered by the federal. By the 1990s, nearly 45,000 miles of interstate highway were complete. Now, there were a few reasons that Eisenhower was a strong advocate for the interstate system. During World War II, he was deployed in Germany. Hence, he recognized the role of roads and highways in transporting people and goods. Secondly, during his presidency, America was in a Cold War with Russia. If Russia were to drop a nuclear bomb on America, millions of citizens couldn't evacuate due to the poor state of roads and other infrastructure. Having just survived the bloody world wars, most Americans didn't want to put themselves at risk again. It was now the start of a new era for America.
In this century, America has become a nation on wheels. We ride on wheels to work, to shop, to play, to go about any place we want to go.
In the 2 decades that followed the Highway Act, Americans started to realize the unpleasant effects of their decision. Most highways cut right through city centers and downtowns. After all, creating thousands of miles of roads requires a lot of space. This meant that anything that stood in its way, be it homes or businesses, had to be wiped out. Almost 1 million people were displaced to create the new highway system. The effects were obvious. Cities were sliced in half, neighborhoods were isolated, and pollution found a way inside the city core. Residents in wealthy cities like San Francisco, New York City, and Washington, D.C. began to fight back. People who had the means to organize and protest were able to stop the highway authorities. In San Francisco, people were successful in stopping the construction of the double-decker Embarcadero Freeway along the waterfront. Consequently, several planned interstates were abandoned or rerouted to avoid urban cores. Still, there were regions that were not spared. One of them was Rochester in New York. There's a 2.7-mile ring that encircles downtown Rochester. The inner loop creates an infamous divide between the city's black neighborhoods and the rest of the region.
And so you had this great divide, so we lost our resources, lost our connections to what we did have in the neighborhood, and so that creates a decline.
After years of discussion, it was agreed to remove a section of this expressway known as Inner Loop East. The plan was to convert this area into pedestrian and bicycle paths. The inner loop consisted of a 6-lane freeway that was removed to create a 6-acre community space. Walking down Union Street today, you will find new apartment buildings, trees, and a bike lane. There's also a road that accommodates two-way traffic between Monroe Avenue and University Avenue. The design reconnects nearby neighborhoods to the east end by restoring the portions of the street formerly blocked off by the inner loop. The government also plans to take down the rest of the highway in the future. When the inner loop was being constructed, the city's population was at its peak. It was a thriving neighborhood, but by the 1990s, the number of residents had dropped by a third. The densely populated grid pattern was no longer there. Instead, it was replaced with paved roads. As neighborhoods were replaced, the surrounding streets declined economically. Since the highway's removal in 2017, Rochester has witnessed increased walkability by 50% and more economic activity. There are many similar examples like this throughout the U.S. Take Boston as a reference. Interstate 93 was made right through the heart of Boston. It separated city's north end and waterfront neighborhoods from its downtown. This highway was elevated and consisted of 6 lanes. When it opened in 1959, it was used by an estimated 75,000 vehicles daily. By the 1990s, this number grew to 200,000 vehicles per day. It was usual for this road to experience congestion for up to 10 hours. Traffic jams of 16 hours were predicted for 2010. Not to mention the expressway wasn't safe to use. It had tight turns, an excessive number of entrances and exits, and entrance ramps without merge lanes. The highway's accident rate rose to 4 times the national average. This was a worrying situation for Boston. Residents quickly renamed the expressway as the Distress Way. By the mid-1990s, Boston had enough. A plan to remove the 6-lane highway was drafted and was completed by 2007. In place of the old highway, the city built an expressway beneath the existing road. The area is now converted into a 17-acre linear park known as the Rose Kennedy Greenway. The park links downtown and adjacent neighborhoods that were formerly separated by the highway. Ever since the highway's removal, Boston has attracted $7 billion in private investment. The city was also able to restore Boston's waterfront as an amenity. While the highway removal was a much-needed relief for everyone, it came at a staggering cost of $24 billion. It's arguably the most expensive highway project undertaken in American history. And that's one of the many reasons why highway removal is such a controversial topic. It's expensive, and there are a million ways it could go wrong. And yet, the amount of money that's invested in highway removal is still dwarfed by the amount of money that exists to build highways. States like Texas still remain car-centric to this day, and they aren't backing down any soon. Texas is spending a whopping $13 billion on expanding the I-45 highway. Houston's worsening traffic and inevitable population growth are some of the reasons why the government is actively pursuing it. The project involves rerouting I-45 through downtown Houston and adding more lanes to accommodate traffic. This also includes making the highway more flood-resistant, a major concern in light of destructive storms like Hurricane Harvey and Tropical Storm Imelda. The project has faced the same scrutiny like most highway projects. Opponents raise concerns that the expansion would displace hundreds of residents in historically Black and Latino neighborhoods. In fact, the project was put on hold for this very reason in 2021. It was only after the Texas pledged $30 million for the displaced residents that the project was resumed. As the construction progresses, several businesses are forced to relocate. No amount of monetary compensation can make up for the damage done to locals. Ignoring this notion, Texas is doubling down on road building. The State Department has announced $85 billion for roadway construction over the next 10 years. Given the continuous traffic in America, creating more roads seems like a natural choice. The most easy option for transport officials is to add more lanes to an existing road or bridge. However, it has been proven time and time again that adding lanes only makes the congestion worse, not reduce it. There's a famous quote by American urban planner Lewis Mumford. He states that adding car lanes to deal with traffic congestion is like loosening your belt to cure obesity. When you add more lanes on a highway, more people are encouraged to drive, which eventually leads to the same level of congestion again. This concept is known as induced demand. Let's demonstrate it further with an example. In the early 2000s, the Katy Freeway was one of the most congested highways in the U.S. To solve this, officials decided to expand it. At its widest point, the expressway had 26 lanes, including service roads, making it one of the widest highways in the world. The expansion cost $2.8 billion and was completed in 2008. And yet by 2014, travel times increased by 30% in the morning and 55% in the afternoon. More lanes encourage more people to drive, leading to even more congestion. That's why solving congestion is much more than just expanding a highway or even removing it. To solve this problem in the long term, investments need to be made in public transport like metros, buses, and trains. An up-to-date public transport system encourages more people to use it and ditch their cars. Yet the concept is still concerning to many. And that's mostly because investing in public transport isn't cheap either. But if done efficiently, it provides an effective fix for generations. The irony is that many Americans haven't experienced a pre-highway era. The only time they see this concept is when they visit Europe on vacation. There has to be a detailed public discourse like exhibitions and debates about the future of transport in America. The nation is currently spending billions on public projects across various cities. Here's what cities like Los Angeles and New York will look like in the future.